This podcast is brought to you by Nuveen and Ruffer. Nuveen has provided investment excellence for 125 years. With expertise across income and alternatives, Nuveen continues to expand its capabilities while maintaining its legacy as a leading investment manager. Visit nuveen.com to learn more. Investing involves risk, loss of principal is possible. Ruffer is a London-based asset manager founded in 1994, managing over $25 billion for institutions, pension funds, charities, and individuals. They have a single investment approach that aims to deliver positive returns across the full range of market conditions. Investing involves risk, loss of principal is possible.
The value proposition of compensation, of public scrutiny, of honestly every challenge being kind of multi-stakeholder in nature really isn't the most compelling value proposition. I want you to take a pay cut, subject yourself to scrutiny and unfair criticism, deal with challenges and stakeholders you've never thought about before. And ultimately, you may never be thanked for a job well done, and you'll always be criticized for a poor job. That's the way a lot of folks might think about it. I sort of recognize all of those challenges and still see the ability to have an impact as one of life's great opportunities. And if you're fortunate enough to be in a position to have impact at scale in a way that's unique to your talents, it is really, really something to be grateful for.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Kurt Summers, who's a senior managing director and head of public-private partnerships in Blackstone's infrastructure group. In this capacity, he's responsible for investment strategies in partnership with governments, public entities, civic and labor organizations, and broader stakeholders to help advance local infrastructure priorities. And he also advances Blackstone Infrastructure's ESG efforts. He was elected and served as Chicago's 70th city treasurer until 2019. He also served as both chairman of the Chicago Infrastructure Trust, where he led the largest lighting retrofit project in North America, and chairman of the Chicago Community Catalyst Fund, a first of its kind $100 million local investment fund focused on private investments in Chicago neighborhoods. During his time as city treasurer, Kurt sat on the trustee board of the Chicago Police and Pension Fund, of which I was CIO at the time. So we had the pleasure of working together in the past. Welcome, Kurt. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's so good to see you again.
Well, it'd be great if you could start by tracing your background. Can you tell us where you were born, where you grew up, and about your various tours into investment, through public service, the private sector? We have quite a bit to get through.
Yeah. Well, I'm born and raised in Chicago, where I lived for most of my time growing up and my professional career, and where I also served in both appointed and elected capacities as a public servant. You know, I started my career at McKinsey & Company, and after going to WashU in St. Louis, and I quickly realized that at some point, the brightest minds in consulting were a great training ground, but I wanted to make my way to being the owner of the problem. And throughout my career, I've taken on sort of more opportunities to try to own the problem. After attending Harvard Business School, I helped turn around my family business in Chicago, which is a distribution company on the south side of Chicago, and sort of helped that company grow and expand. And then got involved in my first public-private partnership, which was Chicago's bid to host the 2016 Olympic Games. So I was the chief of staff for Chicago 2016, a valiant but failed effort to host the Olympic Games. But it was sort of my first taste of a significant public-private partnership that would have been the largest in Chicago's history of that sort. From there, I joined the chairman of that, Pat Ryan, in starting a company called RSG, which is now a large publicly traded insurance brokerage. And then I went sort of full into public service. I became the chief of staff for Cook County, second largest county in the country. I was chief of staff to the county board president, which meant at 31 years old, I had a workforce of 24,000 employees and, a $5 billion budget and far too much responsibility for what my resume would say I would have been capable of at the time, but just one of the best learning experiences of my career. I did that for a couple of years and helped sort of turn around what had been a challenged and kind of corrupt form of government for a long time. And then went to Grosvenor Capital, now known as GCM Grosvenor, which is a large alternative asset manager, then just a hedge fund of funds manager now across all private markets and public markets, where there I led our emerging manager platform on the public market side. And I was a member of the Office of the Chairman and sort of helped lead all of our strategy and business development efforts. And then one day I got a call from then Mayor Rahm Emanuel telling me that the treasurer of the city of Chicago was going to be stepping down. And, he wanted to test the waters to see if I'd be willing to run for the office. And after a lot of consultation with my wife and maybe some begging and cajoling, we were able to come to the agreement that it made sense for us. And it was a once in a lifetime opportunity to serve in a capacity where I could put sort of functional expertise to work in a way that served the community that I loved and I grew up in. And that's where you and I met as treasurer of Chicago, and your great service to the Chicago Police Fund and its members and annuitants. So I did that until 2019, and then kind of didn't know what I wanted to do next, and started as a senior advisor here at Blackstone across different opportunities in the firm. And there was a centralization of opportunity in infrastructure, specifically given my background on the public and private sides. And after spending more and more time with the firm, folks that I had known here for a very long time, the person that runs this group, I now have known for over 2 decades, and so many friends and people that I respect and admire that were here. It became obvious after a short while of being a senior advisor that it made sense to go all in and join the firm.
Well, that's a wonderful catalogue of service and experience. I won't even ask the surprises question about any surprises, because I think a lot of those turns maybe did come as a surprise. But I do want to probe a little bit on the service point, because I think it's so unusual to have someone who's spent so much time dedicated to service. And I suppose the need for that is clearly there. Question I want to ask is about, you mentioned having 24,000 employees in one of the roles, and some of these jobs are just enormous. So how did you kind of eat the elephant in that sense? Do you just do the best you can with the resources you have? What kind of a mindset do you have? Similarly, the treasurer role, huge role, and there's only one human being behind the scenes doing this work. So how do you approach that?
I think it's a great question. And I think it's the case for any leader with, whether it's a significant organization or a significant, complex and unwieldy mandate. Ultimately, it's around your ability to prioritize and your ability to surround yourself with great people. And I'm sure the folks that you've interviewed have said similar things. In fact, I've seen some of those interviews and heard some of those interviews, and they've said it. And I think that it couldn't be more true in my own personal experience, that the more I prioritized what was important and the more I sort of forced myself to, in some cases, the conditions force you to ultimately to prioritize, because there's only so many hours in the day and there's only one of you. And I think the more you can do that and the better your leverage, not sort of the more your leverage, but the highest quality leverage you have and the people around you, where you can rely on them and they can rely on you to really do what you say you're going to do and deliver against a shared vision and sort of milestones that are agreed to, the easier it is to manage. In terms of the elephant, the answer is always the same, which is just one bite at a time. But some bites are more effective than others. And when you can figure out which ones will have the greatest impact and which ones you can collectively marshal the greatest number of resources around and support and get some tailwinds, the better off you are. What's unique is in the public sector, you can get those opportunities, I think, at a younger age than in the private sector, which typically happens later in your career. And so all the more reason to have the wherewithal to prioritize and surround yourself with talented people. But they're no less different in terms of the strategy or the stakes. I look at friends of mine and colleagues and peers and mentors that have these tremendous roles across industries and across geographies. And the common theme beyond just tremendous sort of intellectual horsepower and physical horsepower and ability to do this is these people with these tremendous visions always have laser focus on what's important and manage to find the very best and talented people around them.
And just my last question on that is around, I suppose, reward system and mindset, because I think we all know that in the public sector, you will forego some of the financial reward that's available in the private sector. But in exchange for that, there should be some of this, you mentioned the word impact, the ability to have impact, the rewards that come from service. But equally, and this has come up in my podcast with Marcy Frost of CalPERS, which is also on this series, the mindset needed for some of the negative aspects of public service, being in the public eye, being in the line of fire. Sometimes it can be described as a thankless task service. How did you build that mindset and that resilience? Because clearly one never loses that after building it, but it does need to be built.
Yeah, it's a great and keen observation. Look, I think public service really has to speak to the individual. On its face, I would argue the value proposition of compensation, of public scrutiny, of honestly every challenge being kind of multi-stakeholder in nature really isn't the most compelling value proposition. I want you to take a pay cut, subject yourself to scrutiny and unfair criticism, deal with challenges and stakeholders you've never thought about before. And ultimately, you may never be thanked for a job well done, and you'll always be criticized for a poor job. That's the way a lot of folks might think about it. I sort of recognize all of those challenges and still see the ability to have an impact as one of life's great opportunities. And if you're fortunate enough to be in a position to have impact at scale in a way that's unique to your talents, it is really, really something to be grateful for. And each time I've had that opportunity in my life and in my career, I would jump out of bed in the morning and I would be so excited to tackle the things that I did. And I think for anyone who's sort of wired in the way that they can see that value and see the uniqueness of that proposition on the arc of their career and their time here, it's sort of tailor-made for them. Embedded in your question wasn't just sort of how do I think about it, but how do you convince talented people to think about it that way as you're building teams? And it was a very similar message, which is, look, when we all hopefully get to the point of retirement and we're in our destination of, on some rocking chair somewhere, what are we going to remember and what will we be remembered for? And in each one of those questions, it's not really the incremental dollar or even accolade. And it's really about the impact that you had at either a micro or a macro level on the people's lives around you. And there were very, very talented people that in each one of these roles I convinced to come from the private sector, take a pay cut, serve in this capacity, and do so because of the uniqueness of the opportunity and forward-looking 40, 50 years from now, what's really going to matter to you. And I think largely, I found that to be a pretty convincing argument, and we were able to get some really talented people.
Well, definitely the attractiveness of a leader who's is going to inspire is a key part of that. And clearly all this work in public service, your infrastructure is your kind of bread and butter there. So I can understand that was a natural next step for you. Can you tell us a little bit about the public-private partnerships sort of scene in infrastructure? What kind of potential is there? Now we've had some regulatory changes, some legislation, that the Inflation Reduction Act, which hopefully will be promising more investment there. Tell us about what that looks like at Blackstone.
Yeah, I think it's a tremendous time to be at the center of the public and private sectors. We believe, and I've sort of long held personally the belief that we're better together. We're better when we invest alongside each other. We're better when we share ideas. We're better when we view this as We have common problems that we can try to solve together with all of our resources. And I think at Blackstone, there's just been a tremendous platform to do that. As an example, right now in the US, in 48 of the 50 states, we have some form of public-private partnership or some public asset entity or regulator, even where we've had a partnership or we have an ongoing partnership that is supporting our ability to deliver some significant infrastructure asset. And it doesn't really happen in a silo in either direction. We see that in our investments in renewable energy, whether that's recently announced solicitation that we won on offshore wind, which is a long-term partnership with the state of New Jersey, or where we in the entire Northeast are building the largest contiguous network of electric vehicle charging stations on public toll roads. These are long-term generational partnerships with public entities. They're largely using public assets or with public counterparties or having public customers in some cases. And in each case, the public entity benefits from having a partner that can catalyze with additional capital resources, manpower, and know-how. And we certainly do. We couldn't do this without them and vice versa. This is a unique time in our country's history where you have tailwinds around significant public investment that is encouraging private investment.
And now we bring you a message from one of our sponsors of this series, Nuveen. Nuveen has provided investment excellence for 125 years. A lot has changed, but one thing remains constant. Including different types of durable income in portfolios can help investors meet their goals. With expertise across income and alternatives, Nuveen continues to expand its capabilities while maintaining its legacy as a leading investment manager. Visit nuveen.com to learn more. Investing involves risk, loss of principal as possible. And now, back to the show. And some of the things you mentioned touch on this, but could you talk about your work on advancing ESG efforts within Blackstone? Because I know that's within your job title as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The ESG efforts that we think about at Blackstone are all tied to value creation, right? We see ESG really as part of our fiduciary duty. What are all of the avenues that could represent risks for an investment and could also represent an opportunity? We have such a strong and dedicated platform in Blackstone of specialists that understand all of the elements of ESG, from great governance and carbon accounting to workforce practices. And we leverage that great dedicated team as well as our asset managers. We have over 200 people that are dedicated to supporting our portfolio companies on a host of all these issues. And ESG is really just integrated into that work. In the infrastructure group, in addition to the asset management team or the Blackstone sustainability team, we work closely with every deal team to identify for every single investment, both the risks and opportunities that a lens of these ESG variables present for any investment that we're looking at. We do it sort of pre-investment committee process, in the diligence process, and then on a pro forma basis, working with the asset management team to put together 100-day plans and action plans for every single asset. That's a very proactive approach to identifying and addressing or advancing many of those either challenges or opportunities.
I want to pick up 2 points, and we'll start with impact. Firstly, urban impact. And this is obviously, as your time in public service, very much the forefront of your mind there, I'm sure, certainly in Chicago. What does urban impact mean to you? And how can we have that kind of impact today through investment products?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, in my personal capacity, I think there's so many ways to have impact in urban areas. I think about it almost on a spectrum. And it starts with us being good stewards of financial capital. I think you can appreciate as much as anyone when you have, let's start with public plans that are challenged in many cases with their funded status, their liquidity, what their historical return profile has been. Before we get to the direct impact of our investments and those assets, you have to start with being a great steward of that capital on behalf of participants and retirees and annuitants. And so, from my perspective, that's a responsibility, given my former role as an allocator and a fiduciary. That's the highest responsibility that we have, is to protect and advance those capital needs. I think beyond that, I think it's really just about opportunity. And as an investor, you look for opportunities where others may not see them, and you look for opportunities where investment need may be greater if you can generate a significant return. And there are countless opportunities there in urban markets. As you see, the funding challenges have been some of the greatest, and you have some significant platforms. We have many cities today where we invest by virtue of large scale platforms that we have. We've made an investment in a city, it's created jobs, or we have a significant opportunity to make more investment. And the way that I personally look at that, starting with us being a good steward of the capital, is this going to address a need for that community? Is it going to address a need that otherwise isn't or can't be filled through public funding alone? And will it create sustainable opportunities in the future, whether that's job creation or supporting a new industry or advancing some form of training or a broader ecosystem in a city? We see this now in cities, and I don't want to single any out because they're all my favorite, but we see this now where we make an investment in a data center, and then there's also an opportunity to invest in the airport, and there's also an opportunity to invest in renewable energy, all because we have a footprint that you can sort of more easily leverage and build on, and you have an ability to engage with all of the decision makers and the actors in a way that's far more efficient than restarting a new type of investment in a new geography. So when we see those opportunities, the ability to scale up across multiple sectors inside of the infrastructure bucket is significant. And then at a firm like Blackstone, where you also have investments in real estate, and you also have credit investments, and you also have private equity investments, there is real leverage and advantage to scaling up where you've figured out how to make investments efficiently. And most of the time, you see great opportunities to do that at scale in urban markets.
It's amazing that network effect, clearly, of, you said, having a geography and being strategic in that. The other aspect of ESG, which was very close to our hearts at the Chicago Police Pension Fund, was investing in diverse and emerging managers and ensuring that that was trickling up and down within the industry, not only into diverse owned firms, but also within every firm. How would you rate, I suppose, the evolution of that? And where do you think we are today in terms of getting to a good target?
Yeah, I think that there has been an evolution of it. I think back to my time in former roles running emerging manager funds or programs, where the conversation felt in many geographies like regulatory requirements versus opportunities to find new talent and new strategies to deploy capital. And I think that's evolved. And I think in many respects, because of the great performance of many diverse and emerging managers, a number of institutional allocators have watched that over the last decade or 2 decades in some cases, and seen just what a significant pipeline that is for new investment ideas and for great talent and for returns. So I don't think the conversation is yet where it needs to be, which in my opinion would lead us to not have to need any of the programs that specifically call out those managers, but they're rather just part of a pipeline that can freely compete and get allocations because they're tremendously talented as they are. But until then, I think that we've made really great progress. And I'll just say at Blackstone, obviously, we're not allocators to funds in the same way. And in my group, we're certainly not. But the way that we think about the world is this is really about finding high potential employees, partners, whether that's inside of Blackstone or at our portfolio companies. And this is all about kind of inclusion and mentorship. And it's a thing that, as you mentioned, I personally have dedicated most of my career to. And at Blackstone, it's no different, right? We've got formal programs and platforms in place like career pathways, which create great opportunities for diverse candidates and our portfolio companies and inside of Blackstone. But ultimately, it's about a commitment to inclusion. And it's about a belief that more diverse perspectives leads to better outcomes and better ideas and more talent. And the wider the funnel that you have, the better the outcome at the end of it. And so that's been fully embraced as I've seen at Blackstone. And it's been a fun journey to take something that's been very important to me and apply it at a platform like this.
I'd love to move to some personal reflections now. So, leadership style. So, you've moved through public service, now into the private sector, been in both previously. How would you say your leadership style has evolved over time? And does it have to be different according to the setting?
It's a great question. I would say that my own belief on leadership is that it should be an evolutionary process and that your style about anything that you do, interpersonal engagement, leadership, communication, should meet the situation and the players of that situation as needed. So the short answer is yes, it's evolved, and yes, it is malleable depending on the situation and purpose. How has it specifically for me over time? I think I've evolved from the old saying to a hammer, everything's a nail, which is probably me as a younger leader. I was a hammer looking for nails. And now I've got a much wider toolkit for any number of trades that need to be applied. And so what I hope is that over time, I add both to the number of tools in my toolkit that can be applied to various situations, but also my ability to discern which tools required for which situation. And I think that given that I've had a lot of different roles in my career, I've had a lot of opportunities to learn just that.
And speaking of the course of a career, were there any setbacks or challenges or investment mistakes in there that you learned lessons from?
Sure. I think anyone who says no may not be as aware as you'd like them to be. But I think in general, what I've learned over time and the mistakes that I've made have had one of two categories. I either relied too much on the pattern recognition of something I've seen succeed or fail in the past. And so that led me not to take the next step of diligence of an opportunity or an individual. Or I relied too much on my own ethos and belief in a strategy or an opportunity or the need for something relative to a specific team's ability to execute it or corporately our own ability to execute. And so that could be in either direction, but they both represent subconscious biases that I think many people, we all probably have at some level. You've seen this before. You have a set of beliefs as a result of it, or you have conviction in something and that drives how and when you're willing to push because of the level of conviction and belief that you have in the idea. And I think in general, it's just a reminder that in as much as possible, we have to recognize our unconscious biases and we have to be as objective and empirical as we can. And I continue to learn best practices on how to do that. I think Blackstone as a firm has a great set of processes. They've been doing this for 40 years to really test assumptions and push to any number of outcomes to make sure before we invest $1 of capital, we've thought this through. And I think it's been a great example, as I said, continuing to learn.
It's really interesting because so many of these podcasts speak about the benefits of pattern recognition and that skill. And I think what you've highlighted is its usefulness, but to a point, not to the point of it not allowing you to maybe make assumptions that you shouldn't do. My last question is about highs and lows, because I'm sure with such a varied career, you've had many highs and many lows. Any one or two that you can pick out to share?
Well, the biggest low I've had professionally was in October of 2009 when we lost the Olympic bid. I remember being in Copenhagen. We had a tremendous delegation, Oprah Winfrey and Michael Jordan and all of these dignitaries from around the country. And obviously President Obama and First Lady Obama there to do the final presentation. And it's the only time in my career where I've shed a tear about a professional outcome. And it was that night in Copenhagen after we lost. So it's by far the biggest low. I think the biggest high so far, there's so many to choose from. I've had just so many great experiences. But one, I would say, high that I sort of continue to have today, or if I can pick two. One is personal to me and my family. I left Goldman Sachs to go help turn around my family business almost 20 years ago. And that company is still thriving. It's run by my mother, who's a phenomenal leader. And it's just been great to watch a business that was sort of a lifestyle company thrive in the way that they have. And they create tremendous opportunities for a lot of folks who have needed a second chance in their careers for one reason or another. And what they are doing on the south side of Chicago, I'm proud of her and I'm proud of them and this thing that was started. And then the next high was kind of being in the role that I'm in. This role didn't exist before I got here. It was co-created by me and others. And the fact that it's been successful, we've created tremendous partnerships with public entities, with labor, with our investors over the last several years. And it was something that we just kind of drew up on a blank sheet of paper one day and said, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? And now we're here. And we've done it in a way that's been supportive of some tremendous investments and that have created great returns for our investors. So I'm kind of candidly in the middle of the second high right now, and knock wood, it continues for quite some time.
Well, long may it last. And it certainly is the case from my perspective as an allocator that partnership, collaboration, cooperation is the way of the future. And it sounds like we should get your mother on the podcast too. It sounds like she's got a story to tell. What a wonderful thing to hear that she's still at the helm there. Well, thank you so much, Kurt. It's been a joy to follow your career. And most importantly, thank you for your service, because it is only through the selfless service of people of your caliber that we elevate roles like Treasurer of City Chicago. And by elevating them, we will continue to attract some of the top minds in the industry. And that's critical because there are many hundreds of thousands, millions depending on it. So thank you for setting the standard there and for continuing to do this work in such a unique way and for sharing your insights here with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear from more inspiring professionals and their personal stories, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.